The tea in the porcelain cup had grown cold, a thin film forming on its surface, mirroring the gray, overcast sky outside the window. Elias sat in his high-backed armchair, his gnarled fingers tracing the deep scars on the armrest. To the world, he was a 98-year-old relic of a forgotten era, but inside his mind, the roar of the McCoolin AM-38 engine was still deafening. "Grandfather," a soft voice broke the silence. It was Sarah, his granddaughter. "You've been staring at that photograph for an hour." Elias looked down. In his lap lay a faded, sepia-toned picture of a young man standing in front of a jagged metal beast, an Ilyushin IL-2 Shturmovik, the flying tank. The young man in the photo wasn't smiling. His eyes were hollow, reflecting a horizon that was constantly on fire. "I'm not just looking at it, Sarah," Elias whispered, his voice like dry parchment. "I'm listening to it. If you stay quiet enough, you can still hear the scream of the wind through the bullet holes in the wings." He closed his eyes, and the scent of the lavender in the room was replaced by the stinging stench of high-octane fuel, burnt cordite, and the damp earth of a makeshift airfield near Kursk. August 1943. The heat was oppressive, a heavy blanket of dust and humidity that choked the lungs. We called the Il-2 a flying tank, but on the ground, it felt like a coffin made of wood and Stalin's pride. My rear gunner, Misha, was whistling a tune that he'd heard on the radio, cleaning the soot off his UBT machine gun. He was 19. He still thought we were immortal. "Elias, briefing in 5, the commander shouted, his voice rasping for years of cheap tobacco and screaming over engines. I stood up, my flight suit sticking to my back. My heart wasn't racing. It had settled into a dull, rhythmic thud. We weren't heroes yet. We were just components in a machine, destined to fly low, hit hard, and hope that the German flak cannons were having a bad day. "Check the tail section again, Misha." I squinted at the sun. I felt a wobble during the landing yesterday. "She's fine, Captain," Misha grinned, showing a missing tooth. But I knew better. The sky didn't want us. The sky was a graveyard, and today, we were invited to the funeral.
The transition from the ground to the air was never graceful in a Shturmovik. It wasn't like a bird taking flight. It was like a boulder being hurled into the sky by sheer mechanical spite. As the wheels left the dirt runway, the vibration traveled from the floorboards through my boots and settled deep in my teeth. "Altitude, 300 meters," I barked into the intercom. "Misha, keep your eyes on the sun. If the 109s come, they'll come from the glare." "I see him, Captain, or I'll see him soon enough." Misha's voice crackled back, sounding strangely thin against the rhythmic thumping of the engine. Below us, the Russian steppe was no longer a landscape of farms and villages. It was a scarred, blackened map of craters and burning husks. We were part of a V formation, 12 planes, 12 flying tanks, skimming so low that the propeller wash kicked up dust from the sunflowers. Then, the horizon began to blink. It started as small, rhythmic flashes of white light. Then came the ack-ack, the terrifying rhythmic thud of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The sky around us suddenly blossomed with ugly, oily clouds of black smoke. Every explosion sent a physical shockwave through the cockpit, rattling the glass. "Correction! Flak at 10 o'clock!" Misha screamed. A shell detonated just to our left. I felt the Il-2 shudder as shrapnel tore through the outer wing skin. The plane groaned, a heavy, metallic sound of stressed steel, but she held. That was the secret of the Ilyushin. She was built to bleed and keep flying. "Target in sight," I yelled, more to steady my own nerves than to inform Misha. Ahead of us, a column of Tiger tanks was crawling through a ravine like prehistoric beetles. They looked slow, but their machine guns were already turned upward, spitting lead. I pushed the stick forward, the nose of the plane tipped, and the world began to rush toward me at 300 kilometers per hour. The cockpit grew intensely hot. My palms were slick with sweat inside my leather gloves. I lined up the crosshairs on the lead tank. My thumb hovered over the red button on the stick, the release for the RS-82 rockets. Don't blink. If you blink, you're dead. If you pull up too early, you miss. If you pull up too late, you become part of the scenery. Firing. The wings bucked as the rockets ignited, trailing streaks of white smoke. A split second later, the ground erupted in a fountain of fire and dirt. I didn't wait to see the damage. I mashed the triggers for the 23mm cannons. The sound was like a giant hammer striking an anvil right behind my head. Clang, 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 clang. The tracers chewed into the earth, stitching a line of destruction toward the German convoy. For a heartbeat, I felt like a god. I felt invincible. And then, the cockpit glass shattered.
The sound was not a bang. It was a high-pitched crack, like a whip made of ice. A single 20mm shell from a German flak panzer had clipped the frame of my canopy. Shards of bulletproof glass designed to protect me turned into tiny, jagged daggers. I felt a sharp sting across my cheek, and then something warm and sticky began to flow down my neck. My vision in my left eye blurred, masked by a crimson veil. "You ice, you hit." Misha's voice was a frantic screech over the intercom. "I'm alive," I roared back, blinking rapidly to clear my sight. "Status, what's behind us?" "Schmitz, 2 of them, diving from the clouds, 6 o'clock high." The Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the predators of the upper blue. They had waited for us to expend our rockets, waited for us to be low and slow, heavy with the weight of our armor. I looked at the instrument panel. The oil pressure needle was dancing, a bad sign. The engine was coughing, spitting black smoke that trailed behind us like a funeral shroud. "Hold them off, Misha. I'm taking us into the tree line." I kicked the rudder pedal hard, forcing the massive IL-2 into a sideslip. We were so low now that the belly of the plane nearly clipped the tops of the charred oaks. I could see the faces of the German infantrymen diving into the dirt as we roared over them. Behind me, Misha's UBT machine gun began to bark. Thud, 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 thud. It was a rhythmic, desperate prayer. "They're churning! They're coming for another pass!" Misha yelled. I looked in the rearview mirror. A slim, silver shape was growing larger, the yellow nose of the Messerschmitt glowing like a predator's eye. I saw the flashes from its wing-mounted cannons. Cling! Flak! Crunch! The bullets chewed into the wooden tail section of my plane. The controls went limp in my hands for a terrifying second before the cables caught again. The IL-2 groaned, a mechanical beast screaming in pain. "Misha, talk to me." Silence. "Misha, report." The intercom gave only the static of the wind rushing through my broken canopy. I risked a glance back. The rear cockpit was a mess of twisted metal and smoke. Misha was slumped over his gun, his head tilted at an impossible angle. The whistling tune he had been humming that morning was gone, replaced by the roar of the wind and the smell of ozone. No, Misha, not today," I whispered, my voice breaking. But the German pilot wasn't finished. He was pulling up, banking for the kill shot. I was alone in a broken tank with wings, leaking oil and blood over a land that didn't care if I lived or died. I looked at the ground, a small clearing, surrounded by peat bogs. It wasn't a runway. It was a gamble. "Hold on, kid," I said to the ghost of my friend. "We're going down." The ground rushed up to meet me, not as a surface, but as an enemy. I cut the ignition. The roar of the McEulin engine died, replaced by the terrifying whistle of the wind through the jagged edges of the broken cockpit. "Brace, Misha. Brace," I croaked, knowing there would be no answer. The belly of the Shturmovik hit the soft peat of the bog with a bone-jarring thud. The world turned into a washing machine of mud, grass, and screaming metal. The armor plating underneath me groaned as it plowed through the earth, acting like a giant shovel. I was thrown forward, my harness cutting into my shoulders, my head snapping back against the seat. Then, everything stopped. For a long minute, there was only the sound of cooling metal. Ping, click, hiss. A thin wisp of oily smoke rose from the crumpled cowling. I sat there, my lungs burning, my vision swimming in a sea of gray and red. I struggled with the latch of the canopy. It was jammed, twisted by the impact. I hammered at it with my fist, then my shoulder, a primal panic rising in my throat. I couldn't die here, not in a tin can. With a final desperate heave, the glass shattered further, and I tumbled out onto the wing, then slid
freezing muck of the marsh. The mud was cold, so cold it felt like fire against my skin. Misha, I scrambled to my feet, my left leg buckling under my weight. I dragged myself toward the rear cockpit. The tail of the plane was shredded, the fabric and wood hanging in ribbons. Misha was still there, slumped over his machine gun. His eyes were open, staring at the horizon we had just fallen from, but they were empty. The bullet had been clean, straight through the plexiglass. He hadn't felt the crash. He hadn't felt anything. "I'm sorry, kid," I whispered, my voice breaking into a sob. "I'm so sorry." I reached in to grab his dog tags, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unhook the chain. I wanted to take him with me, but I heard it, the distant, rhythmic barking of dogs and the faint shout of German voices. The hunters were coming. I looked at the IL-2. She was a broken monument in the middle of a swamp. I had a Tokarev pistol with 2 magazines and a map that was soaked in my own blood. To the east lay the Russian lines, miles of forest and occupied villages away. To the west, the German infantry was closing in. I leaned my head against the gold metal of the fuselage one last time. "Sleep well, flying tank," I muttered. Then I turned and limped into the thicket of the blackened forest, the shadows swallowing me whole just as the first German motorcycle rounded the edge of the clearing.
The forest was not a sanctuary. It was a cathedral of shadows. Every step I took felt like a betrayal. The snap of a dry twig sounded like a pistol shot in the damp, heavy air of the dusk. My flight boots, never designed for long marches through marshes, were heavy with mud, pulling at my ankles like lead weights. The wound on my cheek had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed with every heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of the glass that had nearly blinded me. My left leg, however, was the real problem. The crash had twisted something deep in the knee, and now a dull, grinding pain was radiating up to my hip. I collapsed against the base of a massive, lightning-scarred pine tree. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. "Stay awake, Elias," I hissed to myself. "If you sleep, you're a corpse." I pulled out my Tokarev, 7 rounds in the clip, 1 in the chamber. 8 chances to stay out of a prisoner of war camp. I remembered the stories we heard back at the airbase about the pilots who were captured. The Germans didn't have much mercy for Shturmovik pilots. To them, we were the Black Death, the ones who turned their elite panzer divisions into scrap metal. Suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a sound, it was a smell, the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke and roasted potatoes. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs ached. Through the thick undergrowth, maybe 50 meters ahead, I saw a flicker of orange light, a campfire. Germans or locals? I crawled on my stomach, ignoring the mud soaking into my flight suit. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would give me away. I parted the ferns with the barrel of my pistol. Around a small, sunken fire sat 3 people. They weren't in uniform. An old man with a beard as white as the winter moon, a young woman in a man's oversized coat, and a boy no older than 10. They looked like ghosts, hollow-cheeked and haunted. The woman held a rifle, an old Mosin Nagin, with the practiced ease of someone who had used it recently. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice sharp as a blade. She didn't look toward me, but she shifted her weight, the rifle barrel tracking the darkness. I had a choice. I could stay in the shadows and die of infection and cold, or I could trust the people who lived in the ruins of my country. "I'm a pilot," I croaked, my voice sounding foreign even to me. "Ilyushin too. I went down in the marsh." The woman stood up, the rifle aimed directly at the spot where I lay. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then the old man spoke. "If you're a German trick, you'll die before you see the fire," he said calmly. "Come out, hands where the boy can see them." I dragged myself into the light. When they saw my blue flight suit and the gold star on my shoulder boards, the tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It became a heavy, somber respect. "Misha didn't make it," I said, for some reason needing to know. The woman lowered her rifle and walked over, kneeling beside me. She didn't offer a smile. There were no smiles left in 1943. She just looked at my wound and then at the sky. "The Germans are patrolling the road," she said. "They found your plane. They'll be in these woods by dawn. Can you walk, pilot?" "I have to," I replied. "Then eat," she said, handing me a charred, half-raw potato. "Eat quickly. We leave for the partisan camp in 10 minutes. If you fall behind, we cannot wait." The night was an inkwell spilled over the world. We moved like ghosts, a line of silent shadows cutting through the thick brush. The girl, whose name I learned was Katya, led the way.
She didn't use a lantern. She seemed to feel the forest, navigating by the tilt of the trees and the smell of the damp earth. Every time my injured knee buckled, I bit my lip until I tasted blood to keep from crying out. I felt heavy, clumsy. In the cockpit of my IL-2, I was a god of thunder. Here, I was just a limping target in a bright blue suit that screamed, "Shoot me," in the moonlight. "Lower," Katya hissed, her hand flat against the air. We froze. In the distance, the low rumble of a truck engine vibrated through the ground. Then, a beam of light cut through the trees, a German searchlight from the main road. It swept over the pines like the finger of a vengeful deity. We pressed ourselves into the freezing muck. I lay there, my face inches from a patch of moss, watching a beetle crawl slowly across a twig. I thought of Misha. I thought of the way he'd look at this mud and make some joke about it being better than the mess hall soup. The truck passed. The light faded. "Why do you help me?" I whispered as we stood up. "It's dangerous to carry a wounded man." Katya didn't look back. "Because you are the one who burned the fuel depot in Ozarovo last week. I saw the smoke. For 3 days, the Germans were too busy fighting fires to hang anyone in our village. You gave us 3 days of life, pilot. Now I give you yours." The weight of her words was heavier than the armor on my plane. I had never seen the faces of the people I was saving, or the ones I was killing. From 1,000 feet, war is a map. From the ground, it's a girl with a rifle and cold eyes. Suddenly, a sharp whistle echoed from the front of our line, the old man's signal. Contact. The forest exploded. Not with the roar of cannons, but with the sharp rhythmic rat-tat-tat of an MP-40. Tracers, like angry fireflies, zipped through the leaves, shredding the ferns around us. "Ambush," Katya yelled, pushing me behind the thick trunk of a fallen oak. "Don't use your pistol unless they are on top of you. Save the noise." I saw them, great shapes moving through the fog that had begun to roll in. A German patrol, likely the ones who had seen my plane crash. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. Concha raised her Mosin Nagant. Crack. A gray shape fell. She bolted the rifle with a mechanical, frozen calm that made my blood run cold. I pulled my Tokarev, but my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization of how small I was. I wasn't behind 800 kilograms of Siberian steel anymore. I was just a man in the dirt. "Grenade," the old man shouted. A metallic cling sounded nearby. I didn't think. I grabbed Katya's collar and threw us both into a shallow ditch just as the world turned white.
The world was a muffled roar. The grenade had left a high-pitched ringing in my ears, a thin scream that drowned out the forest. I struggled to breathe through the curtain of dirt and acrid smoke. Beside me, Katya was coughing, her face masked in gray ash, but her hands were still locked onto her rifle. "Move!" she screamed, though her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "To the ravine! Now!" I tried to stand, but my injured leg gave way. Through the shifting fog, I saw him, a German soldier, barely a man, his face pale with the same terror I felt. He was raising his submachine gun, the barrel cold and indifferent. I didn't think about the physics of flight or the orders from the high command. I pulled the trigger of my Tokarev. 1, 2, 3. The recoil felt like a solid punch to my arm. The soldier slumped back into the ferns. There was no triumph, only a hollow, sickening weight in my stomach. "Elias, the bridge!" Katya grabbed my webbing and dragged me toward a narrow wooden structure over a rushing stream. The old man was already there, laying blocks of what looked like soap, explosives. "They have armored cars coming up the road!" he roared. "If we don't blow the crossing, the camp is gone!" Bullets chewed into the wooden planks of the bridge. I looked back and saw the headlights of a German Hanomag half-track cutting through the trees. It was the same machine I had hunted from the sky only hours ago. Now, it was the apex predator. "The fuse is wet!" the old man cried out, his hands fumbling with a sputtering cord. "It won't catch!" I looked at the flare gun in my flight suit pocket, the one I was supposed to use to signal rescue planes. Then I looked at the leaking fuel canisters the partisans had placed under the bridge. "Run!" I shouted to Katya and the old man. "Elias, no!" Katya reached for me, but I shoved her back with a strength I didn't know I had. I scrambled onto the bridge. The half-track was 50 meters away, its machine gun spitting lead that sparked off the iron bolts. I felt a hot iron rod sear through my shoulder, spinning me around. I fell to my knees, the world tilting. I pulled the flare gun. I aimed it not at the sky, but at the dark, oily puddle beneath the bridge. "For Misha," I whispered. I fired. The world turned into a sun.
A wall of orange flame roared upward, consuming the wood, the bridge, and the front of the German vehicle in a single deafening heartbeat. The force of the blast threw me backward, spinning me through the air until I hit the icy water of the stream. The current was a cold embrace. As I drifted into the darkness, the last thing I saw was the fire reflecting on the water, looking exactly like the burning sunflowers of the Kursk fields. 65 years later, the tea was now completely cold. Elias blinked, the morning sun of the present day warming his wrinkled face. His granddaughter, Sarah, was still watching him, her eyes full of a concern he didn't deserve. "Did you make it back, grandfather?" she asked softly. "After the bridge." Elias looked at the old photograph of the Shturmovik. He remembered the partisans pulling him from the water, the weeks of fever in a hidden dugout, and the final walk across the front lines under a moonless sky. He remembered the medals he never wore, and the friend who stayed behind in the marsh. "I made it back, Sarah," Elias said, his voice finally steady. "But a part of me is still up there, 300 meters above the earth, banking into the sun." He reached out and closed the photo album. The story was 50,000 words long in his heart, but some things could never be written. They could only be felt in the vibration of a passing plane or the smell of rain on a dusty road. The flying tank is still flying, and Misha is still humming his tune.